Alright, so we are talking about conic sections. And if it was not completely obvious to you, the word conic comes from the word cone. Okay? And to section something means to cut or to slice. Okay? So, a conic section is a slice or a cut from a cone. So that's literally what it means. And what we saw in our video is depending on the angle of your cut, the cut produces 3 different conics. So the first one that was cut was an ellipse. And so that ellipse, sorry, let's lock that focus. An ellipse kind of looks like an oval. Okay. But it's a closed figure, closed curve. But if your cut is parallel to the base, then you get a special type of ellipse, which is a circle. So when all your points are equidistant from the center, you get a circle. And a circle is a kind of an ellipse. So it's not a different thing, but it's just a special ellipse. So it's an ellipse where you're in a circle, the radius is the same all the way around, whereas an ellipse, the distance is not the same all the way around. We're going to talk about the ellipse and the circle in detail next block. Alright, the other kind of cut produced a parabola. Now, you guys are familiar with this term parabola from Algebra 1, Algebra 2, but you're used to looking at your parabola from a function notation. The parabola is the equation y equals x squared. Quadratic equations create a parabola. And of course, this is all related, but we're really looking more at this, a little bit more geometric perspective of the parabola. Now, the one thing that wasn't talked about in the video is that when you have this cone, try and do a 3D type shape, and the narrator talked about the angle of your cut being congruent to the vertex angle. Well, that's a true statement. But what happens then if those two angles are congruent? That means that your cut that you're making is parallel to the side of the cone. So if this cutting angle is congruent to this vertical vertex angle, then if you remember back from geometry about transversals and blah, 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 congruent angles. So if these angles are congruent, these two lines are parallel. And so the word parabola comes from parallel. Now when you study your parabola on a function perspective, you're like, what does a parabola have to do with being parallel? There's no connection there. But when you know that your parabola comes from being parallel to the side of the cone, then you can see that connection in the word. Alright, then our third conic, which we'll study last, is going to be the hyperbola. And the hyperbola, the main thing to remember about the hyperbola is it's going to cut through the upper nap and the lower nap. So it's when you're doing a slice that's going to be steep enough to cut through both. And so your hyperbola is going to have two parts. And those two parts don't touch each other. But if you kind of draw an X and your hyperbola goes and is kind of asymptotic, it approaches the sides of the X like that. So a hyperbola always has two pieces to it. So those are our three conic sections. We're going to study parabolas in depth today, and then we'll do the ellipse and the circle next block, and then we'll do the hyperbola the block after that, and then this little mini unit will be wrapped up. Okay, so it's a very short unit. All right, so now we're going to make a parabola. Everybody's going to get to make one. So I'm going to give you some patty paper. I don't know if you ever used this in your geometry class. It's just thin paper. It's called patty paper because it's the kind of paper that they put between hamburger patties. But this did not touch any meat products. Don't worry. Just put your phone up. You should have a protractor on your desk from last class period. If your desk did not have a protractor, you can just grab one from around the desk. And the other thing you'll want is sometimes pencils or ink pens tend to rip the patty paper because it's so thin. So you're going to want to write. So good writing instruments, a fine marker if you have a thin marker, a felt tip pen. You can come borrow markers up here if you want. I don't have thin ones. I wish I did. All right, so I'm going to talk you through some folding.